We should be the carriers of confidence. Real show is about to begin.
So we've heard both cases from both speakers, and now we'll have a short discussion for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So I'll just kickstart things off with the first question for Sharif. And it's about Peter's contention with your assumption of causality. And he found it problematic that you were able to extrapolate causality, whether it be through induction or intuition, in your argument for God. And I think you would agree that causality is essential to your argument for God. So how would you sort of counter that contention?
Yeah, there's quite a few points that I want to make about the issue of causality. The first one is, when we look at the issue of causality, the argument against causality generally is that on a quantum level, things are acausal. These weird, strange things that happen on a quantum level, like a photon of light can act both as a particle, as a wave. It's a wave duality paradox within light. Wheeler's experiment shows some strange things, that the cause actually comes posterior to the actual initial shooting of the photon. Things like that. There's a few problems. The first problem in this discussion about causality and denying it outright is that in essence you're denying the scientific method. I would say that. And the reason why I would say that is because the scientific method, like you rightly said, it's not about seeing directly, it's about sensing what you're looking at. So effectively you would take an experiment, you would put it under causal conditions, and you would isolate a variable, put it under different conditions, maybe on heat, light, maybe you'd shoot photons at it, you would do something to subject it to a set of causes or conditions, and then you would record its results. And the results are effectively the effects of the method of the experiment. And then what you do is your conclusion determines the relationship between the cause and the effect. So causality is an axiom that science is built on. To deny causality fundamentally means to deny all the whole premise of the scientific method in this regard, and that's a problem. The second issue I'd say about causality, if you can give me a chance, is that we tend to use this idea of causality when it comes to the issue of God. So when it comes to mundane things, one brother, he was telling me the story about the woman who when basically the baby had left, didn't know where the baby was. I think the name was Linda Chamberlain, wasn't it? Yeah. And
Lindy.
And if you think about it, the baby has now disappeared. The mother's not going to start thinking, maybe according to the laws of quantum mechanics, it could have disappeared, and I'll just wait here. She's probably thinking the dingoes ate my baby. So, on a serious note, though, we think in a real world this principle of causality. Causality is built upon the principles of scientific methodology is built upon the causality principle. And the other thing is that I mentioned this point, which is that things are limited, they are also dependent. So we are saying that we are judging upon the fact that things require some sort of an explanation, some sort of conditioning. And I would say if we really want to take the acausal quantum level interactions as a real thing, and we want to say this is really puts all causality in doubt, we have a fundamental problem, which is why on a macro level do we have causality, which means why on a big level do things affect by cause and effect? If I was to throw this bottle at the chair, he's not going to go straight through him, because the particles may be in that position or not, and it just goes through him according to the laws of quantum mechanics. It's going to hit him. So why does it hit him? If the thing that it's made up of is acausal, doesn't exist by causality, So macro level events exist by causality, but the thing that they're made up of is acausal. So what causes it? There's a fundamental question, and that fundamental question is answered by understanding that boats float, ships or planes fly through the sky. Why? Because it's exhibiting based upon the causal principle, the patterns of behavior, aerospace, etc. through this. So there's a lot of contradictions if we fundamentally disagree with causality.
Look, let me respond. We're going over some of the ground that we've already discussed, but it doesn't hurt to just go back, and I'm going to repeat essentially some of the things I said. Look, one way to put it is this, that on the one hand, you're appealing to the scientific method, but now you're claiming that your understanding of the scientific method somehow supersedes or overrules what the best science itself is telling us. Now, that's just an awkward position for you to be in, because I've got the modest and easier position here where, as you heard, I defer to what our science says, but you don't want to do that. So when I mention issues of causality, and if they say, for example, as you rightly point out, at the quantum level, you rightly point out, for example, radioactive decay. Einstein, by the way, never accepted it. He was disproved in the sense that science established that radioactive decay, when a particle decays an atom of uranium or something, we didn't know the causes, and Einstein said, look, we just don't know, but there must be a cause when an alpha particle or a beta particle is released. And the best theories at the time said, no, it's not just that we don't know the cause, there isn't one. Now, Einstein had a famous remark there. He said, look, it can't be a probabilistic thing without having a cause. He said famously, God doesn't play dice. Now, he didn't believe in God, actually, but he always mentioned him. And the point of saying that is that you can't just have probabilities without an underlying cause, which I think is your point of view. Modern science overruled him. Now, if you know the best modern science, that's just the way it is. You're appealing to our intuitions and you're rejecting it, and you're appealing to the scientific method, but that's not appropriate, because as we're telling our best science and our best scientists that they're not obeying the rules of science properly.
Just a point. I'm not appealing to the scientific method. What I said in my presentation is that science is limited. We would say science is a branch of a rational method. And we would say, therefore, there are certain questions that science cannot answer. For example, science cannot answer why the scientific method is correct.
Philosophers answer that. That's my business.
Yeah, but we couldn't, just purely from an empirical point of view, you wouldn't be able to say that empiricism is correct or science is correct by science.
No, there are lots of issues about that. So my question to you then is, if you claim that there's some further insight, where do you get it from?
Right. So I'm saying is that if we go beyond the scientific method, we use a rational approach. A rational approach therefore accepts principles like causality. Why do we accept principles like causality? Because we need it as a necessary principle to think. We need it to think, to make sense of the universe around us. Maybe if
We're going in circles now.
I'll give you an example of this. If we really deny all causality, which is what?
In some cases.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it? In some cases we deny causality, in other cases we don't.
But now you're arguing with the science.
No, I'm not arguing with the science. I'm saying in some cases, what is the explanation? What's the reasoning? Why in some cases there is no causality? For example, why is it that this bottle of water is made up of acausal events, but when you bring the acausal events, they become caused? If it's not what it's made up of, then the cause for it to exhibit consistent behavior within the universe. That's where the fundamental problem within science is at the moment, which is to understand the consistent behavior on the macro level when you don't have consistent behavior, only probabilistic behavior on a quantum level. Even just going further to this point, me saying, as an example, that there is a cause to the universe, or what did the Big Bang depend upon, this is not just something that I've said. Roger Penrose himself said it. Roger Penrose also used the argument, what's north of North Pole, because we cannot have a before time. But then he changed his position. He said...
He was right the first time.
He said, well, you just said we depend upon the science and I don't know the science. And this is what I'm saying, is that you've got Professor Kaku, who also talks about there being a potential state of nothing where you have just an absence of matter. You've got other, Dr. Singh, Distinguished Research Fellow of the Premier Institute of Theoretical Physics. He talks about that there was a previous universe before the Big Bang. You got Professor Smolin, researcher, again at the same university, who said that the Big Bang arose from a black hole from a previous universe that collapsed. You've got Neil Turek, who talks about membrane structures before the Big Bang and the membrane structure. So I'm saying that your argument of saying, well, we can't ask the question of Big Bang, what came before the Big Bang, because the science doesn't allow us. There's scientists telling us this.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay, but they're saying something different from you. I accept what you're saying because there are alternative theories now about how to understand the singularity and whether there is some way to make sense of before or other universes. I understand that physics is telling us a lot of stuff, and in their capacity as physicists, as scientists, they are saying some interesting stuff that may be different from, let's say, a singularity, nothing before. Again, I'm going to defer to what they say, but that doesn't help you, because that's the best science, and my modest position is simply, I have to defer. Let me just focus on this. One of the ways in which you ask the question suggests that we have to explain some things that we might not have an explanation for. I've got, again, a very simple position. Sometimes the best answer is we don't know. And you can't fill that by making up something that suits your other prejudices or other religious or other convictions. There's a lot of stuff we don't know in science. In fact, one of the major features of the scientific method is that we don't pretend we know when we really don't know. And in a way, that's very hard for people. It's actually very difficult for people in lots of contexts, science and elsewhere, to say, look, actually, we don't know. Now, one other thing on that. Scientists, I give my students when we teach, when I have a course on this material, I give them the best scientists and the best theologians, because I think that's the best thing to do, to show them the strongest arguments. One of the interesting things is that when I give them scientists like the ones you're quoting, Penrose and a few others, you have to be very careful as to when they are speaking in their capacity as a scientist, and when they're like Swinburne and various other theologians will say things like Craig himself does that goes beyond our best science. So that's important to understand when they're talking with their scientist hat on. And in some cases, as I say, that I've learned, I guess, I'm like everybody else, I want to know answers for things, but sometimes the only answer is we don't know. And until science answers it, and often in history, it comes up with answers which we couldn't have anticipated.
But this is the point that I was saying, Peter, is that we have certain explanations, certain possibilities. Either something came from nothing, either there is a chain of events of limited things, or either there is some sort of mutual dependency. And I'm saying some of those things are not just physically, rationally impossible. For example, when you said we cannot ask the question before time, you know, what occurred
That's
before
one version
time.
of the physics.
That's right. Is that a physics question,
It's
or
physics.
was that a philosophical point?
No, it's physics. And your point is a very good one, if I could pick up on that. Look, you talk about what must be rational belief, but, you know, we can't depend on what we think naively, intuitively is rational, because in the end, as I've said, science goes way beyond what anybody thought was rational. Already after Galileo, what was common sense and what was rational gets thrown out. That's why I mentioned these examples where we can't rationally believe some of it, so we simply do the maths, as I said. So you're appealing to something that still is going beyond science, to some principle. And rationality, let me put it this way, the history of science since these pre-Socratics is our best embodiment of our rationality. That's been our rationality institutionalized in a method for all its flaws, and scientific method is a complicated thing. Mind you, I have to tell you, only psychologists think there's a scientific method. I have to tell my students that if you're doing psychology, you get a lesson in scientific method. My son has a PhD in physics. He never had a lesson in scientific method. How does it work? They never taught the scientific method. It turns out to be sort of complicated, and there isn't any one set of rules. But so what I'm suggesting is that there's nothing else except the best we can do, and sometimes we don't know, and we proceed that way.
But Peter, my argument was this on the podium. I said that an infinite regression is impossible. I said
Why? Why?
Because we would be waiting for eternity in order to get to
The
this
decision
position.
that
So I'm saying there's an argument there. Now, either we say there's a potential that could actually not occur, that we could have an infinite regress of events. And I'm saying if A is dependent on B, so before A exists you have B, before B exists you have C, before C exists you have D. If that goes on forever, then nothing in that chain will exist. That's what I'm saying.
No,
now, I'm looking for an argument to say, okay, that's wrong because of X, Y, Z. I can't have this blind faith that maybe there's another explanation out there, but science hasn't got it.
It's not a blind faith.
I'm saying we have to look at the evidence we have now, and based on that evidence and based on that understanding, come to those conclusions. So I've given an argument. I've said you can't have a chain of events without a beginning of that chain.
But you can't in science say you can't. You can't simply assert what can and can't be a priori, as philosophers call it. You're asserting something must be the case. Nothing in science must be the case. That's an important distinction. In mathematics, you can say that.
Right.
You can't say it in science.
But there was one thing that I did mention, which is that one of the things that science does say must be the case is causality as a principle.
No, it doesn't say it must be.
For the science to work.
No.
So I'll maybe give you an example. Sorry for carrying. But maybe if I give you an example, For the photoelectric experiment where they hit a photon in a split and it had both a wave and a particle
Yeah.
behavior, the first thing they had to do was what? Shoot the photon. If they didn't shoot the photon, they wouldn't have been able to judge that. So the point being is that you still had to do an experiment, you had to set up the parameters, the variables, you had to then isolate the variables to be able to shoot the photon. Shooting the photon is effectively the cause, and then you record the results. The results being it both behaves as a wave and a particle based upon whether you've sensed it one way or the other. So you're still doing an experiment built upon causality. You're not going outside of causality because you shot the photon.
But that's, look, we're getting into the science. In some cases, that's not an experiment where causality comes into question. That's the duality of light and waves, which is a deep mystery. That's a different mystery.
Yeah, but you understand the point that I'm saying, that they still shot the photon.
Well, yeah, that's what you have to do in some cases. But look, let me try it differently. The idea that you repeal to what rationally must be the case because of an infinite sequence. I know that the Kalam cosmological argument claims that you can't have a real infinity in the world. You can only have mathematical infinities. It's not clear. When the Big Bang Theory first came along, they had previously taken seriously the idea that the universe was infinite in the past. That was a serious view. You can't say it can't be like that. That was what was thought to be possible, and it was a great shock to discover that actually there was a moment when it seems that everything just came out of nowhere. Now that's why the Big Bang was called the Big Bang. It was kind of a rude joke. They didn't take it seriously at first, until I mentioned quickly the receding galaxies and the background radiation, and all this evidence showed that some... Let me tell you a quick anecdote about this. Einstein's theory, when he first came up with his mathematical model, it actually looked like everything's expanding. And he said, that can't be right. The universe is not going anywhere, because that would have meant it came from nothing. And he said, that's rubbish. So he cheated. He fudged. There's a famous anecdote about Einstein. He put in a factor which cancelled out the expansion of the universe until those data came in from Hubble and the recession velocities and the redshift. And then he realized his theory was right the first time. The universe came out of nothing, the North Pole. Now, you see, the idea that the universe was eternal and infinite, Einstein actually thought that. It was a serious possibility. You can't say it must not be the case because you've got no basis for saying what must.
But this is the point. It comes back to the methodology of how we understand the universe and how we develop our thinking. If we take it from a point of view of just purely science, but we need to experiment, we need to see the fact that things are limited before we can prove that it's limited, then I would say that's wrong, because we can come to certain fundamental conclusions. An example of this was David Hilbert, the famous mathematician, who was really enamored by this idea of infinite set theorem by Gregor Cantor, as you probably know. But he also went and he explained in his long speech, he explained how nothing in the universe is actually infinite. And then he said that the idea of actual infinity is an idea, but has no, reality for it. And he gives the example of the Hilbert's Hotel to show the inconsistencies and the paradoxes of this. The other problem is, just to go into the science a little bit as well, the reason why they're looking for what they term a general unified theory of everything is because they're trying to work out Newtonian physics on the macro level and quantum physics with Einstein's special theory of relativity, because as soon as they apply Einstein's theory of special relativity on a quantum level, it falls into infinities. And they say infinities produces paradoxes, which therefore means contradictions, which therefore means that it cannot be true because we cannot fall into infinities. That's why the scientists, the physicists, are trying to work out a new theory that looks at the unification of Einstein's theory with quantum mechanics.
When they come up with their answer, I'll agree with them.
Okay, so I think we've established that you don't believe conclusions can be drawn or should be drawn outside the scientific method. And you talked about the problem of assuming things a priori.
Yeah.
So my question is, doesn't that sort of line of reasoning require you to assume a priori that the scientific method is the best way to ascertain truth?
Look, it's a good question. Let me try and answer it. Science, the history of science is not a straight path. It we're a long way from the beginning at this point, and as we all agree, we've found out some extraordinary things. So something about this trial and error and the use of our minds and our intellect to understand the world is spectacularly successful. But it's not making any prior assumptions, and there's a reason for this. Philosophers used to think that science had to have a foundation. It was based on the mathematical idea that if you've got an axiomatic system, you have to have axioms, and they're not proved, you just take them for granted. Descartes and many scientists back in the 17th century thought that that's how science should be. You have to have a foundation, a certain foundation, what must be. That was abandoned. And if you read modern philosophy of science, one of the things that's paradoxical, neither observation nor certain knowledge is the foundation. Science doesn't have a foundation. You might call it circular, but actually there's a famous analogy, if I can give you the analogy. It's in the front of one of the classics in the history, in the philosophy of science, Willard van Orman Quine, 20th century philosopher. He quotes another positivist philosopher who said, our knowledge is like a boat that we're sailing in, that we have to rebuild, but we can't put it in the dry dock. We have to rebuild it while we're depending on it. We're sailing in it and we rebuild it at sea. And the analogy is very nice because he says we can change every plank, so there's nothing that's taken for granted, but you have to depend on part of it while you're fixing the other part. You get the analogy. So that's a good answer to your question. Science, everything is up for grabs. There's nothing that's sacrosanct or taken for granted, but at one point you depend on something and you might find that the whole of the science gets changed. So nothing is assumed. Nothing.
Yeah, what I would say is that everything is up for grabs in science except the scientific method.
But there's no scientific method except using our common sense. Einstein, let me quote Einstein again. He says science is nothing more than common sense writ large. Because you only have evidence, you can only think about it, you can think of best explanations. I give examples from the Greeks. I won't go through it, but I'll give you an example. A guy called Eratosthenes figured out, this was like in, I don't know, when BC, like 500 BC or something. He figured out how round the earth is. How did he do it? I always make a joke. He goes out for a cigarette and he knows he's got a shadow. And then he went for a holiday 500 miles away and he realised he hasn't got a shadow. Without telling you the whole story, he realised that the reason he hasn't got a shadow when he went 500 miles is because the earth must be curved and the sun now comes to different. Now, was he true? What was the scientific method? That's exactly like Einstein. You don't have to talk about fancy science to understand he had some evidence, he made an inference. We now know he got it right. He actually got the size of the earth right in ancient Greece. Now, that's a wonderful example of the method. There's no method. It's just common sense and reasoning about observations. And you could be wrong. Yeah. That's the method.
But I don't mean to pick on that particular point, but this was a point that you criticised part of the argument upon saying it's relying upon common sense. It's relying upon, what's intuitive and reasonable. And I was trying to say, well, this is the reason why we say science and the scientific method is a branch of rational thinking as opposed to the sole basis. And the reason why I say it's not the sole basis because you do get into problems where you can't prove anything exists, and you'll also get into problems where you can't prove that Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa.
Sure you can.
How would you do it by science?
Well, that's an odd example. I mean, I watch, what is it, CSI on television?
Yeah.
There's all sorts of forensic evidence about something that happened before. That's history. There's all sorts of evidence of who did something.
No, but there's no evidence
that
can be tested in the lab.
Why not? You find his fingerprints on it.
There is no fingerprints on it.
How do you know?
So if there was, the only way that we can determine that Mona Lisa, do we have the fingerprints of Leonardo da Vinci to match it with?
His DNA could be on it. Look, I'm making up stories, but you pick an example. But you pick an example where I don't find it at all inconceivable that you could find out that somebody, and also we know that human beings paint paintings. It didn't happen by accident. So we've got a good hypothesis. Yeah. It's not necessary.
No, but the reason why I'm saying it's specific, I know it might seem a facetious type example to give, but the reason why I give this example because it does demonstrate one thing. It demonstrates that even though it's outside of experience and the experimental field, you can still come to certain conclusions. Yeah. Even certain things that cannot be, like for example, maybe nobody's determined that Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa because they did a DNA test. You know that, I know that. Nobody did it because they had his fingerprints upon it. Rather, what they did is because of narrations upon narrations from one generation to the next, which goes beyond science. And this is what I'm saying.
Why does it go beyond science?
Because unless you're saying narrations are part of science.
Well, history is part of science. It's one version of learning about facts in the past based on various kinds of evidence. I don't think the example helps you because history is also a kind of a scientific endeavour. We use evidence. It's indirect evidence. There's lots of things in the past that we don't have direct evidence for, but we have evidence.
But are you talking about evidence that you can test today?
What other kind is there?
So I'm saying that there's evidence which you cannot physically test. So for example, we would say the evidence that there was a Norman invasion in 1066 in Britain, that's not a physical evidence that you necessarily have test. So for example, even if you had no physical evidence that we could test, we would still accept that narration. We would still accept that there was 1066 Norman invasion in Britain, even if there's no physical evidence.
If there's no evidence at all, then you have reason to be doubtful.
No,
you
no,
could be
I'm saying
skeptical.
physical evidence. I'm
Well,
saying
what other kind is there? What is there?
there's narrations, there's statements from one generation
Yeah,
to
but
the
you know,
next.
people tell lies or they're misguided. You don't believe, but testimony is one kind of evidence. Look, this is not the right audience to argue about the let's say, the truth of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but I've had that debate with Christians where they're relying entirely on evidence of testimony, and it's very weak, like all testimony is. But that's also evidence. We rely on that, of course. It's not very strong evidence, but it's evidence.
No, I agree. It's evidence. The testimony is a form of evidence,
Yeah.
but it's not an evidence that you can test in a scientific lab. It's not something that you can develop a hypothesis and develop certain conclusions based upon repetition of an experiment. It's evidence because so many people have narrated the incident that occurred that it becomes impossible for there to be a collective lie and
That's
impossible
right.
for a
That's
collective
right. I agree
mistake.
with that.
That's how we
I
would
agree
say
with
it.
that, yeah.
But that's not science. That's something else.
Okay, so we want to leave about half an hour for open Q&A. So we'll just get the speakers now to just ask questions, if they can just pick one or two questions that they most want to ask the other speaker. So for Peter, whether it be something problematic you find other than causality for the proof of God, or any other question that you have that you'd like Sharif to respond to.
Well, I hadn't thought about it before, but let me try to ask this question. Do you consider your fundamental belief that you're making an argument for, do you think that it's fallible or falsifiable, as philosophers say? Could you conceive that you might be mistaken? That may be a tough question or an unfair question to ask.
Yeah, I think it's unfair because falsifiability is very specific to Karl Popper
No.
and this idea of science. Unless you're talking about just simply could
Let me
I be
ask it in
mistaken?
common sense terms. I just used a fancy
right.
word. Could you accept the possibility? I mean, let me put it this way. When I've debated with various believers in various traditions, I'll say, look, one of us is wrong. If I'm wrong, I better go to the mosque or to the church on Sunday. Friday, I'm sorry. Yeah, but you've got to remember I'm Jewish, so I don't, you know. But you see my point, that in the end we can't both be right.
Yeah.
And so if we're really open-minded, one of us has to admit the other one might be right, and then we've got to change our whole life. Now, I understand that's kind of, I don't know, I feel a bit uncomfortable asking that question, but that's the intellectual question about rational inquiry.
No, that's right. And I think I mentioned it before the debate that part of our Islamic heritage, an example of this was Imam Juwayni, one of the famous scholars of Islam. He taught Imam Ghazali. He was known as Imam al-Haramain, the Imam of the two holy mosques at the same time. 1,000 years ago, he wrote a book and he said, it is an obligation upon every adult that reaches the age of maturity in order to determine their belief based upon reason. And then he explains what reason is, what rationality is, how you determine it, how you don't determine it. And then he goes through various evidences and proofs. I would say, look, just like you'd say you're an atheist, I would say I'm a believer. I believe that's where the evidence lies. But if somebody says to me that not everything is limited, that there are certain things within the universe which are unlimited, that certain things which are not, that limited things are not dependent, that an infinite regression is a possibility and can show me an example, even a theoretical example of a possibility, or mutual dependency, a theoretical example of how it could be possible, or actually give me the science that does say from absolute nothing, and I quoted the professor, American-Japanese professor in America that said, well, we don't really say it's really nothing.
Sure.
Then, yeah, I would change.
Yeah.
But it has to be based upon the evidence that I'm convinced
Look,
of.
I agree with that, and I think that's a good answer, if I could say. It's the answer actually that Galileo gave. He said, you don't have to give up your beliefs, your religion, to accept what science says. And that's why I mentioned that, because it seems to me that it's perfectly consistent to hold on to some beliefs. And in the end, I think that's what we all do. So I think that's a perfectly right answer, yeah.
Okay, so now we'll come to you, Sharif. One pressing question that you'd really like to ask, and how do you respond to it?
To be honest, I've not really thought of any particular pressing question that I'd like to ask. I think we've discussed some of the points already. I would probably just maybe ask about this, the problem with the limitations of science. But I think we've already discussed that primarily. But the fact that certain things we can know, but or may not be scientific, maybe like, for example, the hard problem of consciousness.
Oh, okay. Look, I'm glad you mentioned that. I hadn't talked about consciousness. My main area of interest in philosophy is the problem of consciousness. And let me just, for the sake of talking about something, mention that as by way of an answer. It's not a good example for you to pick to help your case. It's true that consciousness is a very deep problem. I have a stack of books this high just from the last few years on it. Philosophers have been arguing about this for centuries. It seems very mysterious. I think philosophers are mistaken to spend so much time on it. It's certainly part of our lives that we don't understand very well, another case where modesty is required. We know a lot about the brain, but we certainly don't know everything about it. But one answer that is relevant here, you suggested somehow it may transcend our capacity to understand it. Some philosophers today, well, some are talking that way. But you mentioned machines, and one of the things that's interesting is that our scientific understanding of consciousness and the mind and the brain is now so advanced, you would have seen it in lots of science fiction movies, current television programs, they're building machines that can think. I think it's fair to say they are literally thinking. I can explain that if we had time. And I think that they're not conscious, but consciousness is not a light switch that goes on and off. It's a matter of degree. We have a brain. It's, 10 to the 10th neurons, which is a very great many. Worms have much fewer neurons. There's a spectrum. And more or less, neurons give you more or less capacities, intellectual capacities. So, look, if you know science, and today the science of the brain is part of biology, it's not like quantum physics or these things about the universe. We now know too much biology to think that the human being in consciousness is somehow ultimately mysterious or requires something transcending the purely physical, the purely biological. My view is that we are biological beings that are exhaustively explained by the physics and chemistry and the biology.
Yeah. My point wasn't specifically that we cannot potentially understand it through the use of science. I'm saying that...
Why?
No, that's not
Oh, that's not your point.
My point was the fact that at the moment we haven't grasped it, but we still believe it exists. And that's why I was just saying that the limitations of science in terms of we can still come to a conclusion without necessarily having the science to back it up at that
There's one thing to say about we believe it exists. This is the central issue in consciousness. You actually only believe it exists in your case.
Right.
Everybody else here is a robot as far as you're concerned, and me. Now, you only know consciousness. This is one of the problems of the literature, that what you take to be consciousness is what you're aware of in the first person in your own case, the full richness of your mental life. And the idea that somebody else has that, it's just a matter of courtesy. We all look like each other, and so we assume you've got consciousness, but actually you don't know.
Just one last thing I want to touch upon, and then we'll go straight to the open Q&A. So, Peter, you talked about consciousness and how there is an argument that there is nothing transcending the physical, that everything that is there can be explained through biological, chemical processes. So my question is, if nothing is transcendent, and then when it comes to morality, it comes to emotions such as love, such as compassion, if these don't arise from purely biological evolutionary processes, then is it intuition? What is it that allows us to sort of experience these?
You're asking about emotion and love and... Okay. Look, they're biological. I mean, at base. At base, we're animals. We have brain structures that produce in us hormones and various other things. They're very, very well understood. I mean, we don't understand everything. But, it's known that emotions... For example, people have brain injuries. They become somehow incapable of certain kinds of emotional responses. The brain is very interesting and very complicated, but in a way, it's not the right question, perhaps, because it's a machine. And we understand when you interfere or ruin or damage parts of the machine, it stops behaving in certain, sometimes quite predictable ways. So people think emotions are somehow make us unique, but animals also have versions of aggression and love and lots of stuff. Now, we've got such a big brain that we can make poetry about it and we can, intellectualize about it. So certainly we've got a lot more going for us, but they're not deeply mysterious, at least in the scientific sense that means that it should be beyond biology. We know down to the level of the ions going in and out of cell membranes in the brain. We understand it down to the molecular level, what the brain is. Now, we don't understand the complexity of so many wired together, but at the base, it's a complicated machine. So that's what biology is telling us.
I think the problem that we have is that if I can't scientifically prove that you have a consciousness and you maybe just be a robot, then there's nothing that morally makes it wrong for me to kill you.
Yeah.
No, that doesn't follow.
Or stop your robotics from working.
No, that doesn't follow. Could I say something about the morality quickly? Look, the other question which you do raise, it's a very important one. Where does ethics and morality come from if you're an atheist like I am? Because most religious traditions depend on a God and a sacred text that gives you an ethical code. I don't have that. I think my ethics is better. Why? Because it's based on rationality. I think that we as human beings can think. We live in communities where, as Bertrand Russell put it, we should depend on our feelings of love for one another, and those are rational grounds that if we want to live in a civilized, decent society, we can come up with principles, as the great philosophers have come up with, which is not based on a God or a supreme being or a creator. It's based on rational principles that are the kinds of principles that make for decent, happy lives, based on love, which we have as human beings. So I can't give you the full lecture, a whole year on, or a semester's lecture on morality, but you don't have to have a creator or a transcendent being to have an ethics.
Right, but can you have a universal ethics?
Yes, you can, because in fact the great Immanuel Kant and various others showed most philosophers find a way, and they're very concerned with exactly your point. The universalizing of one's ethics comes from certain rational reasons. I can't give you the full account of it, but the great philosophers ask exactly your question, and it's the right question to ask. It's only saying that you can't... See, people who have theological beliefs can't imagine that if you don't have an authority giving you the moral rules, they're not really rules. But when I say, let's say we happen to have probably the same morality in terms of our normative ethics, the actual things we think are right and wrong. We just have a different story about where they came from. People who believe in a creator who gave a divine set of rules, they think they came from one place, I think they come from somewhere else. We may agree on the actual rules. So this is what's called meta-ethics. And there's a lot of literature on how you derive your rules that aren't somehow beyond human life and thought.
Yeah, maybe I'd probably say the problem is that when you start to predicate rationality upon emotional feelings like love, then it becomes subjective. You have people who are, sociopaths or psychopaths. They have a different emotional basis, and therefore the view of what is the right or wrong action becomes different. So I think we've got to be very careful that we don't fall into the trap of being a moral relativist, which I think ultimately occurs when you don't believe in a creator, because ultimately you believe a universe came from nothing, by nothing, for no reason, for no purpose, that then randomly reassembled itself, suddenly became self-aware and tries to replicate itself as much as possible. In that context, putting things like love and justice and rationality and all these becomes irrelevant, because if we are just like the animals, just evolved in a particular different path, and some animals, I heard there's some dangerous animals in Australia, like the black widow spider, it cannibalizes its mate after mating with it. Yeah, it's useful for it. So similarly, there may be a trait in the future that becomes useful in propagating the species. They say one of the most successful members of our own species in reproducing was Genghis Khan, because he pillaged and raped millions or thousands of women across the areas that he conquered, and therefore they say I think 1/6 of the world's population is related to Genghis Khan. Now, does that mean therefore he was successful evolutionary biology because we're just of the material realm? That means that he was morally correct. And that's what I'm saying, is that there is a difficulty. I think the answer to my argument is simply, yes, but evolutionary, we work better and reproduce better if we cooperate. But that's still an argument based upon evolution and materialism, and doesn't fundamentally answer the question why rape would be morally wrong as opposed to not.
Look, I agree with you about this. I won't go on about it, except to agree with you in the following sense. One of the difficulties, certainly for people like me and philosophers, is exactly this dilemma of where you've got Hitler or Genghis Khan or some evil people. How do we rule it out? Now, I've read lots of philosophy books struggling with that, and you're right, it's a problem, because we can't appeal to anything else. I mean, we've got other reasons for not having a transcendent being to give us the rules, so we're stuck with this deep moral problem, and that's why people have jobs as moral philosophers to try and figure out how to answer that question. It's a difficult question, I agree with you.